This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're going to continue to look at Lord of the Rings Limited this week. Last week I took a look at 10 cards in the set that you should not be playing. Basically they were cards using data from 17 lands where I discussed these cards that had win rates that were not very good, but they were being taken way too highly. This week we're doing the opposite. I'm going to take a look at 8 cards using 17 lands data. And these are cards that are being taken later than they should be based on how successful they are in this limited format. Just a reminder about what 17 lands is. You can go to 17lands.com, find all kinds of limited data. You can sign up to have them track your data. It's a great thing to use when analyzing and thinking about cards. Data is, of course, not the end-all, be-all. It doesn't tell the whole story, about what you should be picking and things like that. That's not really a great way to use it because your pick order changes based on what your deck needs, so you can't just always take the card with a higher win rate and stuff like that. But it is useful to look at and think about a limited format more broadly. So as usual, I like to start with a baseline card here, so you kind of get a feel for how good these cards are relative to a card in the format that has a general consensus, I think. And the one we're looking at, the baseline card here, is Errand Rider of Gondor. This has been a really good common. It turns into a 3-mana 3/2 that draws you a card often enough to be a card that you really like to have in most of your white decks. It is taken around a 5th pick, which is quite high for a common, and it's a good one. And it has a 57.8% win rate. That's a pretty good win rate. It's not one that's amazing, but especially for a common, it's pretty good. That said, everything we're going to look at on this list is taken significantly later, and it has a win percentage that is comparable to or better than Errand Rider of Gondor. So let's dive right in. Let's start with Isolation at Orthanc. So this is taken around a 9th pick, and it has a 58% win rate. So a little bit higher than Errand Rider of Gondor, but it's taken far, far later, about 3 picks later. This has turned out to be a pretty good removal spell. People tend to underrate these because, it's hard not to think about the situation where you bounce their bomb and you have to deal with it again at some point, but you're still trading 1 for 1 when you put something on top of their library. It also doesn't hurt that it's really good against armies. Like if your opponent has built up a really big army, casting this on it tends to feel pretty good. But even without armies around it, having this instant speed 4-mana removal spell that can deal with most things, if only temporarily, it feels pretty good. You don't have to worry about triggering a death trigger or anything like that. You have to worry about end of the battlefield abilities a little bit, but the point is Isolation at Orthanc is a card that should be taken around the same time as Errand Rider of Gondor overall. Maybe it doesn't have nearly as much 2-for-1 potential as the Errand Rider, but it's a good card in the format. Next, let's look at Battle Scarred Goblin. So this is taken around an 8th pick, and it has a win rate of 57.2%. So it's a little worse than Errand Rider of Gondor, but still taken about 2.5 picks later. There's nothing special about this card, and I think that's why you can pick them up when you can. Because it's just a 2-mana 2/2 that does 1 to something when it gets blocked, 1 to the thing that's blocking it. But this format has so many X1s in it that basically anything that does 1 to things kind of matters. There are a lot of boards where if you play Battle Scarred Goblin on turn 2, your opponent just can't block it because they just have X1s in play or whatever, and it gets in for a while. Then it has a useful creature type. It ends up being relevant all game long most of the time. So it's a nice little 2-drop for red decks. On a related note, there is the Black Breath. This is taken around the, somewhere between the 10th and 11th pick, has a 57% win rate. This has been surprisingly good. It has to do with a few things, namely what I was just talking about with Battle Scarred Goblin. Every color pretty much has some X1s they play in the early game that they want to play in the early game, has some token generators that they want to play. And so the Black Breath really allows you to, stem that tide. And then, adding the Ring Tempts You to it definitely does make a difference. That effect is pretty good. But this has turned out to be a card you can play 1 of in your main deck, and I think you should, generally speaking. If you're playing any deck that isn't aggressive, you should probably have a Black Breath in your deck ready to go. Next, let's take a look at Deceive the Messenger. So this is taken around the 9th pick, and it has a 58.6% win rate. So, that's significantly higher than the Errand Rider of Gondor, almost a full percentage point higher, and it's taken much later. It is slowly moving up in people's pick orders, but this thing has just been really good. I mean, as has been the case lately, like 1-mana things that do multiple things, have multiple effects, they just tend to be good. I mean, because they're so cheap. And it's not that hard to actually trade with someone when you cast this card. Again, if your opponent is attacking you with anything that has 1 toughness, and less than 3 power, you can just get it by casting this. That's all there is to it. And the fail case is still a 1-mana 1/1, does some stuff with your amass. And there are other times where you can really blow someone out with it, like a combat trick. But it ends up being pretty easy to trade 1-for-1 for only 1 mana. And sometimes you get a 2-for-1, and that has been really good. I will say, this is one of these areas where I think the data doesn't tell the whole story, because you don't really want to jam a bunch of these into your deck, because they are still somewhat situational. And while the floor is reasonable, if that's what you're doing with it most of the time, it gets a lot worse. And so having more than one of them isn't always a good idea. If you end up in a world where you have a bunch of spell payoffs and you want to cast cheap spells, it definitely moves up a little bit. But this is something you definitely want one of in every single one of your blue decks. And the win rate reflects that. This has a win rate better than many cards in the format. In fact, well, I guess it's the 3rd highest of what we're going to see on this list. So Deceive the Messenger has been quite good. Next, let's look at Shalob's Ambush. So this is taken around the pick 8.4, and it has a 60.6% win rate. It's in kind of a similar area as Deceive the Messenger. It costs 1. It does 2 things. Those things are pretty good in the format. +1/+2 in Death Touch helps your creatures win mini combats quite effectively. The food token you get has, just gaining life with this is plenty good, and sometimes you can do some extra stuff with it. Just like Deceive, I do think, unless you're the most aggressive deck in the world, you probably only want 1 or 2 of these, because they are still combat tricks. But, if you time it right and don't go too crazy on trying to play them, both of these, Deceive the Messenger and Shalob's Ambush, can be quite effective 1-mana sort of combat tricks that can really produce blowouts. Next, let's talk about Quarrel's End. So this is taken around an 8th pick, and it has a 59.4% win rate. So this has been a lot better than I sort of expected. I think I talked about it probably in the What I Got Wrong video already, but I had a hard time believing that making a 1/1 could make up for making Tormenting Voice costing 1 more mana. But it turns out it makes a pretty big difference. Adding to the board, even something as small as a 1/1, is a huge upgrade, and it's worth the mana in the end. It helps that this format isn't the fastest. I think there are some formats where this would just be worse than Tormenting Voice because you have to wait a turn, but I think in this one it works out pretty well. Making that body matters. It happens to be a human. You can sacrifice it for value. You draw deeper in your deck when you cast Quarrel's End. So this is another card where you probably don't want a bunch of them, but the first one should be prioritized relatively highly because it does such a good job of increasing your chances of winning. Next, let's look at Warbeast of Gorgoroth. So this is taken around a 9th pick, but it has a 58.6% win rate. So that's the same as Deceive the Messenger, and it's significantly higher than Errand Rider of Gondor. So all on its own, this is a 5-mana 5/4 that dies into a 2/2 in a mass Orcs 2 anyway, whether it gives you a body or makes an army bigger. And that's just a pretty good rate. You end up getting a lot of value out of this card. It can give you a 2-for-1. And then it also works really well with all your other high power things. It can be particularly spicy if you have a big army already and you can attack with it. And, your opponent, if they want to kill it, is just going to give you a 2/2, in the aftermath. So it can end up manufacturing a bunch of 2-for-1s if your situation is set up really well. But just in general, it's very hard to interact with the War Beast of Gorgoroth and feel like you're coming out ahead because, whether they block with it, whether you try to use a removal spell on it, all of it feels awful because Amass Orcs 2 as a death trigger is big enough to really matter and really be frustrating for whoever's playing against this thing. And it has a really high ceiling. So, it's one of these classic cards with a high floor and a high ceiling that no matter what your opponent does, it feels kind of like a losing situation for them. So it's ended up being quite good, and it should be taken earlier than it is. And our 8th and final card here is Dreadful as the Storm. This is one that has surprised me the longer the format has gone on. It's, by the way, taken around an 11th pick, so taking the latest of anything on this list, and it only has a win rate that is 0.1% lower than Errand Rider of Gondor's. So this has turned out to be pretty good. Ring tempts you. Attaching it to anything feels pretty nice. And this ends up being a better trick than I really expected. We've seen a lot of these cards over the years that change a creature's stats, change their base power and toughness. And virtually every time we've seen that and there's not a cantrip associated with it, it ends up being an awful card in Limited. And that's kind of where I went with Dreadful as the Storm. But in this format, for one thing, this is cheaper than a lot of those we've seen before, but this format has enough other stuff going on that this is pretty sweet. Adding the ring tempts you at instant speed can actually matter, especially when it comes to having one of your ring bearers get through and hit your opponent. Sometimes you can just end the game on the spot by casting Dreadful as the Storm, making your creature bigger, and then they lose the 3 life from the final ring bearer bonus. There aren't that many ways to get you tempted by the ring online at instant speed. There also aren't that many ways to take full advantage of that apart from your creature getting through. But overall, being able to use this on a ring bearer that your opponent couldn't block because it's a ring bearer ends up feeling pretty good. It works reasonably well with armies too. So, 2 of the, best mechanics in the format in terms of how they've performed work really well with Dreadful as the Storm. This is another card I will say that's in the same neighborhood as Deceive the Messenger and Shalob's Ambush, because both of them, this is another trick. You don't usually want to jam too many of them into your deck, but in almost every blue deck, you kind of want the first Dreadful as the Storm, and that first copy will perform fairly well. Well, that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. I'll be back next week with another video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description.